that unlocks people's potential in so many ways. And we know that there is a housing crisis. Some people are calling it a housing emergency now that vitally needs attention. So we've been pleased to see it getting some of that attention on Labour's agenda and how the party's moving forward, and we expect in the manifesto as well. But there's probably still more detail to come. So I'm delighted to have such a knowledgeable panel joining to help that conversation, to really think about what we need to do to meet people's housing aspirations, and Vicky when she gets here as well. So I'm going to start by introducing Councillor Stephen Cowan, leader of Hammersmith and Fulham Council, who's going to talk to us about what they're doing there, but also what can Labour do. Chris Norris, Director of Policy and Campaigns at the NRLA, who we're delighted are partnering with us on this event and helping us bring this conversation to Party Conference. Richard Rowntree, Managing Director of Mortgages at Paragon Bank. So we've got lots of different parts of the housing ecosystem in this conversation, and Vicky will join to offer that kind of campaigning voice and I think kind of the needs of the people in this as well. So we're all going to start by saying kind of 5 or 6 words each, minutes worth of words. That would be a challenge and a tough one on such a complex subject. And then we'll turn that into more of a conversation. We're keen to bring in contributions from the audience as we go as well. So I'm going to turn first to Councillor Stephen Cowan. What are you doing in Hammersmith and Fulham, and what do you think Labour can learn from you and do differently to solve this housing crisis?
Well, I've never really want to say that people can learn from us, but I can tell you what we're doing. I mean, just to frame the situation, Hammersmith and Fulham has the 3rd highest land values in Britain. And we came into office in 2014, as many people considered it a shock win. We didn't, but certainly many people in the building industry did. And what we found was an awful lot of homes being built, which weren't necessarily going to be lived in by UK residents. And what had happened in the Second War since 2008 was the biggest property boom in the post-war period. And so property had moved from being a home for many builders into a speculative investment. And a lot of that investment came from overseas. And so we had an awful lot of homes left empty, but being built almost like, you were literally in the process of making the equivalent of gold bars. And so we came in with a very strong approach that we wanted to build affordable housing. One of those genuinely affordable housing is social housing. And that's what we've been doing since. But then it leaves a problem, doesn't it? Because, and that problem's best encapsulated by a meeting I was at the other day and by a woman I met as part of the process of interviewing people for a PRS review I've been doing. I'll tell you about the woman for private rented sector housing review. Sorry. Thank you. I hate those. Yes, I hate when people do that. So, I was talking to a woman about who's well paid and lives with her partner. And she was asking me about the PRS review. And she said, well, what are you going to do about, how are you going to begin to make it a better place for people like me to live? And I'm like, what do you mean? She's like, I've been evicted 3 times in the last 5 years. And then she said, and what got me was not what she said, it's the way her face crumpled. She then went, I want to have a baby. I'm in my early to mid 30s, early 30s. I want to have a baby, but I can't do it when I'm nervous about my housing situation. Now, if we step back and look at that one example, or the fact that last week when we were talking about launching some new housing scheme we're doing, I was surrounded by 20-somethings who were like, what are you doing about where we're going to live? We've got to a state in Britain where the housing sector simply isn't working for an awful lot of people, for our children, but for everybody, really, 20, 30, 40-somethings who are struggling to find a secure home where they can put down roots in a community, all the things we thought we would do, certainly when I was young, and develop a life. And so I think that is something that Labour has to tackle, is to fix the broken housing sector. And there's a number of things can do that. The PR, there's a lot of very good private sector landlords, and I've been very, very lucky to meet people representing landlords. And they are certainly the best landlords, and which there are many, are certainly part of the solution. But there needs to be a much wider solution, I think, in summary. And to fix the P or S sector, you have to actually fix the whole housing sector. And that means significant changes to how we approach land development, how we approach house building, and the schemes we do to get people into secure homes.
Well, thank you. I'm going to come back to you later and ask you to kind of spell out what some of that would look like. Like what is that development that needs to happen? But Chris, do you want to set out the landlords?
Sure. Yeah, I'm going to try and do it without repeating too much of what Stephen just said, because I don't want this to be too much of a love it and agree fest. But
can you guys use your mic?
Yeah.
Is this not picking me up? Sorry. So a little bit closer. Is that any better? Is this on?
It is on. I think might have to go more like that.
Always good fun when you've got to sit that close to the microphone. But I think what I'd like to
It's
start.
weirdly not picking you up though. I think if you.
Is this any better?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, I'm probably going to look very, very strange on YouTube. But I think what I'd like to do really is to pick up on this point about aspiration, because I think it's really fascinating that we're talking about the public's aspiration for housing. And actually, when we're doing that, I think it's important to make sure that we have a bit of a reality check and actually we understand what we mean by that. Because typically when we talk about aspiration in housing, we're talking about the aspiration for something greater. We're talking about aspiration to own, to have a stake in the market, to have a stake in that property, frankly, to get away from either your family that you're beholden over housing or your landlord, people like me or social landlords. And it's having that agency. But I think actually at the moment, we're not only talking about that kind of aspiration, we're talking about a kind of aspiration that really, well, we should be talking about expectation or even about a right. We're talking about people who don't necessarily in the immediate term aspire to buy a home, they aspire to have a home. They aspire to have a stable, secure, affordable home. And they're not managing to do that in the way that we would usually expect they'd be able to. They may well be renting a good home, but they might be doing that with 2, 3, 4 other people. They might live in a good home, but it might be their family home. They're still aspiring to get on that first rung. And I don't necessarily mean the first rung of the property ladder in terms of investment. I mean part of that journey, that continuum that you're on from the time that you get your first home, potentially, if you want to, and if things work out that way, to the point where you're able to invest and you're able to buy something. And it is part of that journey that I think we need to look at, and not just the traditional, this is the point in life I can get the deposit together and I can buy something. And I say continuum because I think it's all linked. And the reason we've got a problem with people not being able to buy the home they aspire to buy, but also not being able to access the home they aspire to live in the first step, is all to do with scarcity. And really, we're talking about a system which has too much scarcity, quite frankly, where we have this shortage of supply. And it's across all tenures, as I think Stephen was alluding to. We've got scarcity of properties to buy. Of course we do. And we want people to be able to aspire to buy those homes. We've got scarcity in social homes. And, it might be surprising to hear a rep from a private landlord body talking about needing more social homes, but we certainly do. We need to cater for all of the needs. And there's an awful lot of people whose future does not look like buying a home, but actually they need a little bit more support than a private landlord is geared up to give them. And I think any responsible private landlord would say they're not set up to provide a social function. But then crucially, and where I suppose the NRLA comes in, is we also need far more homes for private rent. Because if there's one thing that I would suggest has probably changed in the last 20 years, it's that we've always had, or we've had for a very long time, scarcity in social rents. There's an inbuilt scarcity in properties to buy because that's what's driven the house price appreciation over the last few decades. But now we genuinely have a true imbalance between supply and demand in the private rented sector. And actually, if we want to encourage mobility through housing, we want to encourage people to aspire to have that home, we've got to have that foundation stone, which is the first way into the market for so many people, and that's private renting. And at a time when, frankly, you should have landlords like the members of the NRLA queuing around the block to invest in property because there is scarcity and rents are going up and there is overwhelming demand for property. Actually, they're not. They're queuing for the exit, frankly. We're seeing a 45, 50% increase in demand for rented property But at the same time, we're seeing about 30% of landlords saying, I'm selling some property. They're not necessarily running for the hills, they're not necessarily exiting the market, but they're selling some property. And there's got to be reasons behind that. And that's what I'd like to see Keir Starmer address this afternoon. I would have loved to have seen Rishi Sunak address last week. We're not seeing the kind of policy decisions or the kind of announcements that we need in housing to encourage investment. Because there's a few barriers. There's barriers around finance that I'm sure Richard will address, and there are certain things that we need to see in terms of interest rates that's preventing people from getting on the ladder themselves, but also landlords investing. There's really a crisis around costs because landlords aren't able to see the returns that they want or they need to run a successful and sustainable business. And a lot of that is around the way that we incentivize investment through tax. And I'd like to see more movement around that. But potentially the biggest issue for today, and the biggest issue certainly for this conference, is what landlords need is certainty. Like any business, the worst thing we can have is uncertainty about the future. And if the last couple of weeks have taught us anything, even in areas like net zero or energy efficiency, where we think there's a modicum of certainty about the future or a roadmap, that can be taken away very quickly. Most people in the room will know there's a piece of legislation before Parliament today to reform the private rented sector. It hasn't moved since May, since it was introduced into the sector. We don't know what 2024, 2024, 2025 look like. We don't know what the future looks like for landlords, and they simply can't invest. And if our members can't invest, those homes just won't be accessible. The scarcity will persevere.
Thank you so much, Chris. So finally coming to Richard, I'm moving your mic in further.
Just make sure you can hear me okay. So firstly, I think it's so refreshing to have such an open conversation about housing. It's great to see how much we're talking about this at this conference. I think one of the challenges we have is having a sensible debate and a more holistic approach to the strategic housing solutions is required. If you open the conversation talking about landlords, people tend to glaze over. If you're a banker to landlords, that tends to be the end of the conversation. Really in terms of what Chris has laid out, the demand-supply imbalance is enormous. So the Zoopla data will show you that the demand from tenants is up 51% over the 5-year average. Supply is down 30% over that same period. So of course we need more social housing. Of course we need more affordable housing for first-time buyers, but we need a thriving private rental sector. And this is because we are seeing significant changes in the demographics. People are living longer, people are living alone longer, more kids are going to university than ever before. We now have 3 students for every student bed in the UK. And these are real factors that are driving housing need. And of course, we have a growing net immigration into the country as well. So that infrastructure needs to be thought about. So supporting each tenure, so people have choice. I think this is the significant issue here is where people are most dissatisfied is where they feel like they're entering the private rental sector because they have no choice. They're frustrated because they can't buy, or there isn't opportunity in the social housing for them. So it's a wider issue to look at from that perspective. But of course, we're not looking just to be admiring the problem, trying to be part of that solution. I think I'd almost use the analogy of it's a bit like bamboo. These problems have been around for a while. So they've largely gone unnoticed for many years, but they're shooting up to 6-7 feet within a few weeks. And I think there's 169 rules and regulations that landlords have to adhere to. There's been a lack of building of social housing. We've now seen rising interest rates, which first-time buyers are having to put their plans on hold for a couple of years. And we're almost living in a society now where buying your own home is pretty much becoming a hereditary right. The biggest determinant if you own your own home is if your parents do. Is that really a society we want to be living in? So we've got all of these challenges and clearly opportunities to fix. And that starts with having sensible conversations about not landlord bashing, but having data. And data will only get you so far. I've got so much data coming out my ears to prove some of this, but it's also the human stories that pull in people to have that sensible debate. So great to be part of this panel and looking forward to a lively discussion.
Brilliant, thank you. And welcome, Vicky. Just to explain, these mics, you have to lean in incredibly closely. So I'm just going to rearrange the furniture a bit. So welcome, Vicky. You're having a busy week because housing is so far up the agenda. And just to explain to everyone, Vicky is the housing correspondent for the You're the first housing correspondent, is that right?
I think I don't know if I want to claim being the first in case there's one we don't know about.
For a national paper.
I believe I'm the only housing correspondent at a national as opposed to a property correspondent or social affairs. So my job is solely to look at the housing crisis, the human impact, the economic impact, the social impact.
Yeah. So do you want to start by just saying why this matters to people? We're talking particularly about the private rented sector in this conversation, but why does it matter to people, and what do you think the role of the private sector is to solve the crisis?
Yeah, well, I agree. Human stories are really important in this conversation. So let me tell you some. I just did a big piece about families who've been evicted via Section 21, made homeless, and then because their local council doesn't have enough social housing and can't afford privately rented accommodation in their area for low-income families because LHA is capped, they are being moved out of area. So I want to tell you about Stacey, who was moved from South London to Hertfordshire, which means that she is now separated from the father of her children because he has to stay in South London for work. In her house, there is nothing, because when you're moved out of area, you're given very, very short notice. She has a 6-month-old baby and an 8-year-old. They have no toys. That's her temporary accommodation. That's because she was evicted by Section 21. That's because rents are so high in her home area and social housing is so scarce that she's now been displaced and her whole life has been changed. I wish I could name every person who has slid into my DMs on Twitter or on Instagram in the last few weeks alone to tell me that they can't afford their rent because it's been put up. What do you do? What do you do if your landlord puts your rent up and you can't afford it, knowing that unless Section 21 is banned in the next 2 weeks, as it's supposed to be through the Renters Reform Bill? We are running out of time for the King's speech on that, but we can perhaps talk about that later. That's a desperate situation for someone who has done nothing wrong to be in. Absolutely nothing. There are so many people who are reporting these rent increases to me, above inflation rent increases too. So I think we're in a real bind. It matters to people because if you can't have a stable, safe and secure home, nothing else in your life will work. Nothing. Think about Stacey. Her whole life has now been upended, completely upended. Her children's lives. We know that children in temporary accommodation are at a higher risk of various different illnesses, behavioural problems. It really, really does ruin lives. And that's directly connected to the problems in the private rented sector and the lack of social housing. And I think, yes, part of why I'm late is because housing is taking up a lot of space at this conference, which I welcome. It's a very good thing. And it's a stark contrast to Manchester last week, where even the Housing Secretary, Michael Gove, managed to barely mention housing in his speech, which I found really, really curious. But we are talking about building. I'm encouraged to hear talk of building social homes, planning reform, but I'm not sure that renting has, which is a huge, huge piece of the puzzle, where we are right now, because we've let so much social housing go. We've not done anything about the cost of renting. And as I just mentioned, LHA is frozen, so people on low incomes can't afford their rent. I don't think we're anywhere near resolving that. And I was just on a panel with Matthew Pennycook, Shadow Housing Minister, and I did point out to him that he was avoiding that question. And I think everyone is, because no one wants to touch it. We now spend more on housing benefit than we spend on most government departments. Something's going to have to give. And the cost of temporary accommodation, by the way, is going up. We're expecting some new figures this week. It was 1.6 billion last time I looked. I expect it to be higher than that. So this is really, really bad for people's lives, as I've outlined. It can be devastating, and it's also not cost effective.
And particularly on the private rental sector, what would you like to see happen to improve things and make it work better for people?
I could give you a really long list, but I think there's something very, very simple in terms of how we think about this, right? We could have a really, really detailed, wonky conversation in the weeds of the policy, but the bottom line for me, looking at this for over a decade now as a journalist, is private landlords are housing providers. They play a very, very important role now in our economy and our society because we, as I just mentioned, have hemorrhaged social housing and not built enough to replace it. We need private landlords. They are housing providers. But we have to treat them like housing providers, and they have to behave like housing providers. So we need rents that people can actually afford, government support for those who are in the private rented sector because there isn't enough social housing, and conditions that aren't going to make people sick. And that includes things like the policy that Rishi Sunak just scrapped to improve the environmental efficiency of privately rented homes. That's not just about climate change or net zero or whatever, let me just break that down for you. That is about making sure people live in homes where they can afford their energy bills and where their walls are not covered in mold and damp. That's what that's about. So I think we need to recognise private landlords as housing providers, thank them for the work that they do, but also make sure they behave like housing providers.
Yes. And I think kind of looking at Labour's announcement of the biggest boost to affordable housing in a generation that Angela Rayner made this week, that very much had a blended model of housing. So the private rental sector is definitely a part of that. Stephen, I wonder whether we could come back to you, and you touched on what you think needed to be developed around housing to solve the problems that you're facing and what Labour should do. Zoning in on the private rental market, what would you like to see happen? What would help your residents and you provide for them?
So I've spent the last 9 months doing a review of the private rented sector. So I will be announcing that in
Not now.
November. And as I said to Ben at the back, I need to navigate a position, not announcing it here and now. I mean, look, the private rental sector is a vital part of the housing offer, as Vicky has just said. The case that Vicky ran through is like my weekly surgery. I have lost count of a number of people who have those life experiences. And it's not just morally bad that someone should have to face that. It actually has long-term cost to our society. You're moving children around and you're moving them into areas where they've got no support networks, vast parts of the country, and then you're moving them again, because often they'll move to one area and the LHA rate changes. The long-term cost on that is incalculable in whether they suffer depression in later life, worklessness, or anything worse. So fixing that, I think, has to be an essential aspect of any reasonable government, and the Labour government wants to be completely reasonable in the way it fixes it. We have to change how we view land in this country. We're twinned in Hampton with Barcelona, and when I talked to them about what they do, I mean, we have an innovation district, and they were telling me how they built 10 universities. Like, how did you do it? We just designated the land for universities only. I was like, you can do that? And they can, which means that they had an area that had no universities, and now it's got 10 in 20 years, and they've got loads of social housing around it. And there's no messing about what happens around. There's no land banking. There's no hope value. And all of these homes being built for overseas investors, none of that is allowed to happen. So I think we have to tighten up CPO rules, compulsory purchase order rules, and we have to strengthen the state's approach to land development, I think. And within that, there needs to be social housing and intermediate housing to cover both the groups. And that's going to take a significant change because it takes a long time to build housing. The time you've got the money, got the housing, it can take 5-10 years. So that's sometimes longer, as we've seen, than the life of a government. So the PRS plays a vital role then, which is coming to your question. It just needs to be better regulated. What I would encourage every landlord to do is to register with the NRLA or Property Mark or any other proper professional body, because 71% of them aren't registered. And that's simply not good enough. These are professional bodies. They have their own codes of conduct, set their own standards. And if people were registered, it's a sign that they're running a proper business. The fact that so many of them aren't registered begs the question, why not? And then you have estimates, and I stress these are estimates, that 21% of the private rental sector is below decent home standard. Well, that means the electricity might not be right. There might be damp and mold on the wall. The plumbing might not be fixed. There might be lots of problems with the property. And that can't be acceptable given that this is where people live. And if we regulate food in restaurants, or we regulate how you sell insurance, or we regulate what medicines you can take and can't take, we should be finding a way of making sure that where people live, where they are meant to be most secure, is safe. And we've failed at that so far. And despite good work of the NRLA and Property Mark and others who try and raise standards. So I think the first thing to do is not just about supply, but it's also about standards, because we cannot have people being left with bad properties. You just can't have it. But there's lots of other things we can do, and I'm sure other people on the panel will be able to set those out as well.
Chris, do you want to pick up on that point about standards? But I think there's also there's a wide recognition on this panel politically that responsible residential landlords are part of the solution.
Yeah.
But also, I would imagine some of your members might fear over-regulation that puts them off investing in this area and therefore negatively affects the supply in a different way. So I wonder whether you can pick up those 2 points.
Yeah, of course. I mean, it's worth pointing out there is actually an awful lot of regulation of the private rented sector. It's just not well constructed and it's not well enforced. You know? There is no reason why those properties should be substandard, because there is an awful lot of regulation through the Housing Health and Safety Rating System that determines what a good property is. Now, the decent home standard is a slightly awkward issue for the PRS because it's not been applied to the private rented sector. So I completely accept the figures, but actually it's not something that we've been scored against, for want of a better term. And actually it's not something that was developed for the private rented sector. And it has standards that go beyond what you would consider to be the health and safety of a property. It has things like the proper construction and layout of a property. Now, if you're letting an HMO that was built 150 years ago in a way that it wasn't originally designed to do, it's not going to meet the standard of the decent home standard, which is why we actually support the development of a new or revised decent home standard, which is appropriate for all tenure. It's not trying to get away from having a decent home standard. It's just saying it should be one that actually assesses properties and the way that they're used. I think we should also bear in mind that when the decent home scheme that became the decent home programme was introduced, I think it came along with something like £6 billion worth of investment into social housing. And the biggest change to the aggregate standard of property in the social sector was brought about by demolishing an awful lot of substandard social homes. You know, you demolish the bad, what's left rises up the ranking. So it's a difficult comparison to make, but we absolutely should, as I think Vicky said, have an expectation that the homes that are let, whether they are private or social, are let to a good quality. They are healthy, they are stable, they are secure for people. There's no getting away from that at all. I think I would just pick up something Stephen said there about standards and supply being looked at separately. I think you can't separate those two issues. Actually, you need to have the regulation and proper enforcement to make sure that people that aren't doing the job properly do, but you also need to empower tenants and consumers. And you can only do that if there is a regulation, but also the choice. And one of the problems we have at the moment is, you know, what I would love to be able to say to any tenant who moves into a property that isn't as sold or isn't fit for purpose when they move in, I'd love to tell them, vote with your feet. Stop paying the rent, move out, go somewhere else. Because if that is a rogue or criminal landlord, they are not going to have a leg to stand on if they try to pursue you for the rest of your liability. However, we know in reality there isn't enough property for you to move on to, and there isn't enough affordable property to move on to. So I think if you don't tackle supply, and crucially, if you don't tackle supply across tenure, you're not going to be able to effectively deal with the standards of them. You've got to look at this holistically, and we've got to look at it across tenure so there is suitable property for everybody to be able to access.
Richard, do you want to come in?
Yeah, and certainly the standards and the energy efficiency that Vicky talks about, we have seen an improvement over the last decade, 165% increase in those in the private rental sector which are energy performance A to C. That's 1.9 million properties. It's actually more now than owner-occupied. But that still leaves over half of them that still need to be upgraded. And if you look at the checks and balances a lender can bring to this, we have our own internal valuers. We go inside every single property. Decent wouldn't really be our standard, it needs to be a minimum of good. And that also gives us the opportunity to pick up on category 1 hazards, problems that we really see. But there needs to be a way or a mechanism of flagging that information to drive out those rogue landlords. And I think some of the proposals around property portal could be a good opportunity to do that. And the way this could work, and this is why we're keen to be involved in that conversation and are involved, is almost like an MOT of those properties. So it has to be a certain standard to be rented, to Stephen's point. And then keeping that analogy going, you could almost then apply a sort of driving license approach to the landlord. So they need to be qualified to be able to rent as well. So I think that's a real opportunity in terms of driving those standards. And it's critical because if you look at then, you know, the housing benefit bill of 30 billion a year needs to be cracked. We need to do that in a way that we can drive productivity to invest in more social housing. So we need an economy that's growing. And if you look at the private rental sector, 77% of households are working, which is the highest tenure, and they are the engine room of the economy. But they need decent homes near to where they work, because typically they tend to be key workers, service, hospitality, and don't have the opportunity to maybe work from home or have long commutes. They need to be close to their place of work. So choice and supply is going to help support the entire economy to be more productive.
Vicky, I want to pick up on something you said about the role of private landlords in this. You said that without with so little social housing, actually the role of landlords might change a bit. And I think there might have been a slight difference with what you were saying around not having lots of expectations on landlords to form a more social purpose in their tenants' lives. So, do you want to just expand a bit on what you meant by that?
Yeah, I mean, I think we have a problem. Sorry, I'm not quite leaning in far enough to the side.
They're very unsensitive.
We have a problem because in the 1980s, just before the buy-to-let mortgage was introduced.
Can everyone hear at the back?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, great.
Margaret Thatcher's government deregulated the private rented sector. And that has caused lots of problems. They wanted to encourage investment, they wanted to encourage landlording, but the crucial term there is investment. They didn't want to encourage people to become housing providers. And whether they had a crystal ball big enough to see the damage that several things that they did, right to buy and the deregulation of the PRS, the big bang in the city, which then led to this sort of explosion in the housing market, which we're now also grappling with, which has priced people out of home ownership, would lead us to where we are now. But we are where we are. And if you are a private landlord, you are responsible for people's safety and well-being, and it's a very important job, and you do make money from it, maybe less right now than you have over many points in the last 10 years because of rising rates. Well, not all landlords have mortgages. I actually think most landlords are unmortgaged, so I'm not quite clear where the rent rises are coming from, but I'm open to any information on that the NRLA might have. So I think landlords have to realise that the homes they've bought are not just investments; they're people's homes. They have to treat them as such. Something else I'd like to add, just based on what we've been discussing, I'm very wary of talking about Britain's economy in broad brushstrokes. We have a housing market, we have a housing crisis, but it manifests differently in various places, right? So take Grimsby, for example, where I visited last autumn. Actually, loads of housing stock in Grimsby, but Grimsby has basically been abandoned by the government. Not that many jobs. If you want to train in construction, for instance, there's nowhere near Grimsby that you can do that. So it's really, really tough for people who live there. But there are homes, lots of homes that you could rent that are not that expensive. But I went into one where the floor had literally fallen through. The ones I saw were very, very, very poor quality. But then take London, you have lots of demand. The demand has come back after the pandemic where it briefly dipped. And actually you have some really, really poor quality, incredibly expensive private rented stock. So I think it's really important to try and break down the different areas and take a regional approach as well to the housing market, and not talk about it as though all landlords are leaving in the market and there's scarcity and lack of supply in every region. That's actually not true. And there are other issues as well in for instance, tourism hotspots, where landlords have been turning privately rented homes into Airbnbs or holiday lets because it's more lucrative for them. There's nothing to stop them doing that. And actually, now there's nowhere for people to live. I was in the Lake District, actually just after I was in Grimsby. We drove from Grimsby to the Lake District. That was another marathon week. And I met people who were key workers in the Lake District. If you go to the Lake District on holiday, the person making your food, making your bed in your hotel, if you're staying in a hotel, if you're lucky enough, they might have driven for hours or been bussed in by the hotel because there's nowhere that they can afford to live now in the Lake District. And when I was there, I was in Windermere and I checked, okay, if I needed to privately rent somewhere, what would I be able to find? One place. Airbnb, pages and pages and pages of places. So we're in a real bind, but I'm hesitant, have some empathy for landlords who thought they were buying something they were going to make loads of money on. That's what they were told would happen. That's what we were all told would happen with housing. But it's not really where we are because economies are volatile. The housing market is volatile. Rates go up. You don't make so much money. You might even lose money. And that is something that whoever wins the next election is going to have to deal with.
Thank you. Do you want to come back on that?
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. An awful lot of landlords are breaking even or losing money now. And it comes with the business. It's risk. We're not defending and suggesting that landlords have some right to make a positive return. Of course they're not. Investments go up and down, doesn't matter what the asset is. I think you raised a really, really interesting point around Airbnb and short-term lets as well, because I think that is one of the elements of the scarcity argument. Scarcity is not just about not building enough homes or the planning system holding things up. It's actually where people are incentivized to put their investment, to put their money. And I think the difficulty we've got at the moment is because of particularly the current government's approach to taxing providers of homes, taxing private landlords, it's become much more lucrative to opt out of long-term, stable residential lets and to opt into short-term holiday lets. It's not something we want to see happening because it is taking away homes, particularly in tourist hotspots. One of the things actually we could do, a future Labour government could do very quickly to get landlords investing again, is to roll back some of the changes to the taxation of property income.
Yeah.
And that is putting landlords off investment. It is putting up rents. It's one of the drivers. I completely accept not everyone's got a mortgage, but 67, 68% of NRLA members do.
But the majority of private landlords don't.
I can only speak to the polling we've
I
got.
think it's 83%. I remember the statistic.
I have no idea where that comes from. But
2 million buy-to-let mortgages for 304 billion, which is about 37% of stock.
Okay.
there we are. Now, for one reason or another, and I don't know what the reason is, the NRLA membership is the other way around. About 2/3 of our members have.
Because the good landlords want to be in the body, but the bad ones don't.
Maybe they are. Maybe we'll get that on our marketing. So endorsed by Vicky Spratt, the Independent, the first housing correspondent.
I don't think that's quite what I said.
It's all right, we'll clip it. But sorry, joking aside. But that is one of the things that the government could do really quickly to encourage those landlords that do need finance, or those individuals who have money to invest and want to do something positive with that investment. Because at the moment, if you are somebody who has a windfall, someone who has inherits a sum of money, unless you can afford to go out and buy for cash, property is probably not a great investment right now. And what we do know is if we're talking about simply the net gain on the number of dwellings that we need, the private rented sector is a more efficient user of property. Now, you might not necessarily agree with the way that that's always done, but you'll get more shared accommodation, you'll get higher density development if it's invested into the private rented sector. There isn't the same under occupation. So if we want to meet that need, which is one of the things we were talking about, making it easier for landlords to invest, making it more tax efficient for landlords to invest, is a way that we will get some of that, some of those homes that we need. But the trade-off absolutely is they are housing providers. They do have a responsibility to the people, to their customers, to the people they provide a home, the biggest investment those people will make in their lives to. And when I said before that I think there's a difference, it's because of the social or the capital imperative, effectively. I'm not suggesting that private landlords, private housing providers don't have a responsibility to their customers. Of course they do. They've got to be secure homes. They've got to be safe homes. They've got to be responsive to the needs of those customers. What landlords aren't skilled to do is to be social workers. So if you have somebody who needs additional, if you talk to a typical housing association, they will have people employed, people on the payroll, who are specialists, tenant engagement officers. They are people who will be able to signpost appropriately. They are people who will be well placed to support people who've got additional needs. A private landlord, the best will in the world, is not geared up for that. And I don't think necessarily it should be expected of them.
Yeah, look,
Steve.
Yeah, no, I'm just looking at the figures here from the English Private Landlord Survey, which, 37.8% of landlords regard themselves as residential landlords engaged in full or part-time business. I think all of those people should be in either your body or his body. They should be in a body, and they should seek best practice, and they should seek to excel best practice, which is what the businesses do in other sectors. The problem is, and it's not to say these are bad landlords, by the way, but it is an issue, is 59% of people regard themselves having a long-term investment contributes to their pension. It's not necessarily seen as a business. And actually, as you've said throughout, it is a business. It's where people live. So we have to run it professionally. That's how you run businesses. And I think that's why, working with professional landlord bodies, looking at how we capture the data of what's really going on in the market, because a lot of it is estimates. We don't really know what rents are being paid, because some Zoopla, whereas a proper national landlords register could actually capture rents. And there are amazing people out there. We've been very impressed by Granger, who are building to, who are buy to build to rent. And they've got a system that even controls their rents and stabilizes rents. There's Get Living, which is a completely different marketplace. It's aiming at a middle-class marketplace. But again, they're a highly professional operation and you get a very professional service. But the bit that we've got to remember is this is people's homes. It's not necessarily a market, it's a sector. If you're living in the house, you don't see yourself in a market, it's your home. And what we've got to begin to do is to help landlords meet those professional standards. And I think there's consensus on that. In all the meetings I've had with you guys, we all agree on that. So the question is, how do we do that? And that's where I think there's got to be some changes. Now, we haven't yet got onto rents. And what we do about stabilising rents, and I'd be quite interested in that. But that should be a subject that deserves first and foremost proper economic analysis, because we don't want to be doing one thing only to make it worse, and what looks like the right thing might not be the right thing. But on the other hand, I was very intrigued to see Granger have a rent stabilisation process within their rent deal. And I think that is something that people want as a surety. Now, it is a fact, as I learned from property market, that most landlords don't put their rents up. And so often people don't have rents going up year on year. And that is a sign of the good landlords. But we don't know what's happening elsewhere because most of it is completely unknown to us. It's estimates, it's academic research, and that's the bit we've got to get on top of.
Chris, what's your view on rent transparency? Getting more of the data out there.
I mean, you're absolutely right. There's not the data. There's not the visibility of the data. There is an ONS statistic on private rents. Yeah. It's been experimental for about a decade now. My understanding is that will evolve next year, and there will be more. But the difficulty is we've got this this disparate market. It's very difficult to get all of the data that we need to have a really legitimate, authoritative data set that we can rely on. It is really unfortunate that we rely on the good folk of Zoopla and Rightmove a lot, because they have a wealth of data and they are really free with it and they're great at marketing it, but it is asking rents on a platform. It doesn't necessarily, traditionally I would say agreed rents were somewhere below it. At the moment they're probably somewhere above it, and neither is very helpful. So we absolutely need transparency of data. I think there's a lot that can be done actually via the VOA, the Valuations Office Agency, who collect all the data for the ONS. There's a lot that can be done for trying to use the data that they collect for setting local housing allowance and so on and so forth, and socialising that a lot more. But it's going to take investment. It's one of those things that a government of the future needs to agree to invest in, so that we can make appropriate policy decisions based on the facts, not based on Zoopla's latest press release.
Vicky, do you want to come in on, and then I'm going to move to questions straight after that. Do you want to come in on rents?
Well, yeah, I think this is a really interesting conversation, and I would love to know how the government are justifying the decision to keep local housing allowance frozen when we don't have accurate data on rent inflation. It blows my mind regularly. They know people can't afford their rents. They just don't want to be seen to be increasing the housing benefit bill. So instead of increasing it, they're punishing low-income renters. How are they going to keep justifying that? Labour also don't want to touch this. Nobody wants to talk about rent control, aka rent regulation, which interestingly is actually something Theresa May was quite warm on when she was Prime Minister. She was really coming around to the idea of some kind of rent regulation, because she could see how desperate everything was and had some really, really brilliant housing advisors. That's not something that the Conservatives want to look at. It's also not something that Labour want to look at. I don't see how we get out of this without it. Somebody needs to sit down and do some proper economic analysis of the private rented sector, because we're talking about, I think it's around 11 million people, nearly 5 million households, possibly more at this point. And I really don't like making purely economic arguments, because people's lives are being ruined. But if you were going to make an economic argument, it's not good for an economy that urgently needs to grow, that's facing a recession, if millions of people's incomes are not disposable because of their housing costs. That's
just on that, I mean, the OECD list countries' housing residents as being overburdened if they're paying more than 40% of their salary on rent. It says half of all low-income families in Britain are paying more than 40% on rent. So there is something that needs to be done around the local housing allowance, around the rent stabilisation of the temporary accommodation sector.
Bear in mind at the moment, though, it is a very deliberate, I mean, this is not me defending it, but it is a very deliberate monetary policy to have pass-through of costs, to restrict spending.
Yeah.
Now, I'm not saying that's right, but if we're talking about what a government will do, it's unlikely that one hand will contradict the other.
I'm going to go to questions. Gentleman here and on the left, gentleman at the front, and our colleague on the left here.
Got two quick ones. One, Airbnbs. I don't know why it's so difficult. I think Edinburgh do control it. You can only Airbnb for so many days a year, which makes it less attractive. Okay, if you're doing it for an investment, if you're doing it because it's your second home and you want space. So I don't understand why some of these things are so difficult. And my second is rent's not so much in the private sector, but this definition of social. How can you have a social rent and an affordable rent linked to the market? It's got to be linked to real living wage or something.
Yeah.
Because it is proven that it's about 35% disposable income. If you get above that in rent, you're putting people into debt.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, my one is, and I think around when we look at stock, and we've talked about conditions, what message do we send to a market when, it was around 15 years ago now, we decided to lower the local housing allowance from the 50th percentile to the 30th percentile? So instead of being able to access half of the market, actually telling people on low-income families that you can only access the bottom third of a market. And then 15 years later, we wonder why those same people are struggling and are actually worried about the conditions of those properties, when that was the message, not a second class, but almost as a no class to be able to access those properties. And I am one of those landlords that subsidise my tenant because the LHA won't cover my mortgage, and I do have a mortgage, but I subsidise it because I want to. And you're right, it is an investment, but it is somebody's home and I want to look after them. But it's made continually difficult when LHA is frozen and that hasn't gone up in years, and my open market value has gone up considerably, but I won't make that decision. But I know lots of landlords that would.
And finally, the front left here.
It's depressing. We are a society, and I think now that it's broken, and I hear a lot of people that are saying that they're values led. What I'm interested in is if it's possible for somebody to stick their head above the parapet, whether, if Labour get in, they are prepared to do more than what they're saying now. I wonder whether some of they're trying not to frighten off voters. Sadiq Khan has done some amazing unpopular things because he's in power. So my wish, and I'd be interested to hear people's optimism on this, that the Labour Party have got that appetite.
Thank you. I want to see whether you could take the Airbnb point. Chris, you can pick the local housing allowance, and then Vicky, do you want to come in on what Labour should do? Yeah.
Airbnb is something we looked at, had a lot of advice on it. I don't want to preclude what we're saying, but actually it needs to be tighterly managed, and there are measures that we'll be recommending. I stress I'm recommending this as an independent recommendation. I'm not representing the Labour Party, despite being a Labour councillor. This is an independent recommendation, but there are measures we're recommending on that front that would allow that to happen. I want to just come back to, you can't fix the whole PRS sector, but all we're trying to do is make the PRS sector better. Then we're going to be tinkering around at the edges. We have to fix the whole housing sector in order to make the PRS sector better. You know, the PRS sector is now the second biggest form of tenure. It's doubled in size since 1980. It's used to be social housing. The government has said that the Labour Party, I'm jumping ahead here, the Labour Party has said it wants to make social housing the second biggest tenure. That is part of the solution for dealing with people on low incomes. It's the only solution for people on low incomes. And that's something that I think I would be very optimistic about.
Chris, on local housing allowance.
Sure. I mean, on the LHA, it's worse than you described, actually. I think it was the 2011-2012 CSR where the rules were changed. Not only did we move from the 30th percentile to from the 50th to 30th, excluding if you assume that 30% of housing stock is ever available, that's all you can access. we actually moved from about 600 broad rental market areas, so you had hyper localized rent setting, to about 120, and we moved from monthly uprating of LHA to annually, and then decided to freeze it completely on an annual basis. So aside from the uplift we got around COVID, and I think one other uplift, we are looking pretty much at 2013 rates in 2023. I would be surprised if there are 20% of areas of the country where you can access a typical property in the 30th percentile at LHA rates. It is completely unworkable. And actually it is, I think, a brake on social mobility. It is a brake on access. It's a brake on investment, because a lot of our members cannot let to people and cover their costs at those rates. So it's absolutely a travesty, and it absolutely needs to be uprooted.
And of course, social mobility is really one of the Labour's missions as well. So put like that, it feels ever more urgent. Vicky, what do you think Labour should do?
Well, I think what they will do remains to be seen. But I think there are things they're not talking about because they'd like to win an election, which is what all politicians do when they're trying to win elections. The truth about the housing market is that whichever lever you pull, some unpopular things are going to happen. If you make social housing the second largest tenure and have more low-income people in social housing than you currently have in the private rented sector, well, something will shift in the balance, and perhaps more homes will be for sale for first-time buyers, and perhaps house prices will continue to fall. Don't forget, we're in a housing market downturn. We won't know how serious that is until Q2, Q3 next year, but it could be anywhere between 20 and 30% in real terms, which is going to take us significantly below the pandemic peak. And I mean, I'm in negative equity already, and I bought in 2017, not even at the top of the market. I think we need to wait and see how that all pans out. But what I would say that is not going to sound hopeful, but is actually very hopeful. Liz Truss wasn't elected, and she had some policies that crashed our economy. Yeah. Nobody votes. Yeah. So once they're in power, they can do all sorts of things. Hopefully they won't do that. Yeah. I would prefer not to live through the announcement of another raft of unfunded tax cuts, which potentially crash Britain's economy and housing market. But I think that's an example of how our politics works. So if we are hopeful about anything, Labour is sounding an awful lot like the Conservatives in some ways at the moment. But what happens once they're in government could look very different.
That's the first time I've ever heard anyone asked off some hope and start with a story about Liz Truss. We're cross-party, but I think that is a cross-party position. I'm actually going to ask people to wrap up. First, I just wanted to come briefly to Richard, just to reflect on any of those things. And then I've got a kind of concluding question for our panelists.
Yeah, just wrapping some of those themes together. If you think about the demand supply imbalance, the fact that some areas are challenged around Airbnb, that's not something we would do. We're in this for professional landlords that see this as a business. But let's remember this is the only business that is taxed on revenue rather than profit. I think that's unsustainable for some, and that's a challenge we should look at. But certainly the piece around housing allowance as well. Well, we hear this, there's now 25 tenants chasing every property. And those at the back of the queue are the ones that are dependent on some support and benefits, or more vulnerable. Those that are more affluent can afford to pay rent up front, overbid on rents. And that's a challenge that's going to continue unless we actually create an environment where we can bring more investment in, but look more broadly across supporting all tenures.
I wanted to finish with a question to each of our panelists, which was prompted by something Chris said at the beginning. This conversation was all about aspiration, and I think something in what Chris was saying at the beginning, for me, questioned whether home ownership is the right aspiration for the future. And we know that in other countries, home ownership is much lower, but in this country, it's so a part of our identity and culture. So I just wanted each of our panelists kind of reflect on that. Are we changing as a country? Do we need to change and think about home ownership differently? Starting with Stephen.
No, not really. I mean, look, we've fallen to 65% home ownership. So you take the Germanic countries out of Europe, who have a slightly different model and different approach to home ownership than elsewhere in Europe, then we've got some of the lowest home ownership in Europe now, and that's a significant drop to where we were in the 1980s. So I think that most people aspire to have a home, and if they want to own a home, we should be facilitating that. It comes back to land development. It is ridiculous that where I live in West London, I walk home along the river and large numbers of flats are left empty because people aren't living in them. There's a scheme right in the heart of our innovation district, and whilst we've negotiated fairly hardball with the developer and got a lot of social housing, okay, they told me 65% of the private housing they've sold is to overseas investors. Many of those will be left empty. So I think we just have to fix the sector. It's gone wrong. It's been laissez-faire. It's been chaotic. And I do have a lot of hope for the incoming Labour government. But I don't think any sensible people taking on an enterprise, would start saying, yeah, we're going to be spending this in 2 years' time or a year's time. We're going to throw money at that. Where do you spend it? Is it county lines gangs? Is it the NHS? Is it local housing allowance? And what's going to be the economy like? Are we going to have Liz Truss come back? She was very popular at last week's Tory party conference. So, there is an awful lot of known unknowns. And I think the Labour Party will come in with a very clear objective, which is to fix the housing sector and make it work for all Britons. And I think that will bring about a sea change. And there are professional landlords organisations here. I know they were very keen to work with to raise the standard, raise the bar in the private renting sector.
Thank you so much, Chris. Same question.
Thank you. I don't think culturally we've moved away from the aspiration to home ownership. I think that's something that's been set in train for about the last 70 years. I think you can blame Paragon for that, quite frankly. I think what we have done more and more over the last probably 30 to 40 years is we've stigmatized renting, and that's social renting and private renting. And maybe there's a root to some of that, and maybe actually some of it is just some snobbery. And actually, you think about painting your door a different colour the moment that you bought your right to buy home, for instance. We've not necessarily done anything to put home ownership on a higher pedestal, but we have given everyone that doesn't necessarily want to buy or can't a bit of a kicking. So actually, maybe what we need to do culturally is look at the benefits of renting, whether that's private or social, and actually be a little bit kinder to the other tenures, as well as home ownership.
Thank you, Richard.
Yeah, and just on that, if we think about the ambition that the Labour's looking to set, maybe 300,000 new builds a year. That's a grand ambition if we can get there, but that's only increasing the housing stock by 1%. So you think of a decade out, 90% of what we've got today is what we're going to have then. So if we increase home ownership by 70%, where are the other homes going to come from in terms of social and private rent? Because we're still going to need those. We talk to our tenants regularly, and even those who have aspiration to buy is not necessarily now, because they want to be where their work is, where their social life is, and in the heart of the action. And with prices where they are and affordability challenges, you probably need two incomes as well. So not everybody's at that stage of life where they're ready to commit with somebody to buy a property as well. So I think it's a grand ambition. Anybody that's in that position and supporting first-time buyers, it would be great to get to that level, because if we can help that sort of 20% frustrated portion of private rental sector that really want to buy now and feel frustrated they're paying the landlord's rent, well, there's plenty of people to take their space. So this is that sort of across all tenures supporting each and every one of those.
Thank you. And Vicky.
I actually think we're going to see a bit of a reckoning with home ownership. Sorry, everyone. And I can speak to this from experience. I was born in 1988. I'm a millennial, member of Generation Rent, as some people like to call us. I thought that I desperately needed to get out of private renting into home ownership, did Help to Buy. I am now looking at my mortgage going up by £300 a month, and my 5-year interest-free period on my Help to Buy loan just kicked in, so I'm now having to repay that to the tune of £380 a month. That's an extra nearly £700 a month, guys. Yeah. I am in a top income bracket. I'm very, very lucky. Long may that continue. I really hope it does. But I know lots of people, because they're also sliding into my DMs, who cannot afford that increase. They're going to have to sell. Homes England is not going to make the money back on the Help to Buy loans. This is a crisis that is literally about to happen. And I don't think anyone's got a plan for it. And the idea of home ownership being aspirational, which kind of came about in the last century and has really taken hold, only worked when people were making enormous amounts of money after buying houses. That might not ever happen again, because house prices are at a historic high in comparison to what people earn. We have stretched the economic relationship between incomes and house prices to breaking point. That's why we're in a downturn call it a crash if you want, let's see what happens. So I actually think home ownership is going to start to look very different for younger generations. There's another factor, which of course, when baby boomers start dying, other people will inherit their properties. That may rebalance the market. But I think for people who aren't inheriting money and are buying, home ownership looks very, very different. I'm certainly now considering it more as just renting from the bank. So I do think that that's going to change significantly in years to come. I think that's going to be a big political challenge, because actually both major parties, have relied on the aspiration of home ownership to win elections and drum up interest. And we're seeing that at this conference too. And I would just also clarify, it's actually a bit of a myth that the Germanic countries are majority renting. That was true pre-global financial crisis. But I think Germany is kind of 50-50 now. But German banks won't lend, I think, on less than a 20% deposit. So the housing market is a lot more stable than ours, because we've seen the return of 100%, 95% mortgages since the GFC, which is up for debate whether that's been a good thing. France definitely also have a crisis. I think they're about 40% renting. So similar but slightly different problems. But we're not the only country that's in trouble. But I think we're in a particularly unique situation. And the decision of the sort of David Cameron era policy makers to do demand side reform without looking at supply side has left this government, and also whoever takes over next, in a really, really difficult position at a time when the world is very, very volatile. And the sad events in the Middle East could well prove to be the black swan event that everybody's been dreading for the global markets. And that will impact the housing market further. So I actually think home ownership might start to look a lot less appealing.
I'm going to wrap up there, because I also have a feeling that most people want to go and queue for a certain speech now. So I want to say a huge thank you to our panelists, for everyone joining here, for people who have joined at home, and to the NRLAs for partnering on this conversation. But thank you very much.